The gunshot cracked through the desert air, and when the smoke cleared, Hannah Whitfield was on her knees in the dust, clutching the arm of a man everyone in Redemption Gulch called a killer, screaming the words that would change both their lives forever. Please marry me. It's the only way they'll let me live. If you believe in kindness, faith, redemption, and second chances, I invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The autumn of 1878 had been cruel to the Arizona Territory, and it had been crueler still to Hannah Whitfield. She stepped off the dust-caked stagecoach in the town of Redemption Gulch wearing a traveling dress gone gray with 3 weeks of road grime, clutching a carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world, which was to say almost nothing at all. Her intended husband, a rancher named Thaddeus Cole, who had written her letters full of promises about a white farmhouse and a gentle life, was not there to meet her. Instead, the station master informed her with an uncomfortable shuffle of his boots that Mr. Cole had been killed 3 days prior in a dispute over grazing land, shot dead by a rival's hired gun, and that his cattle, his house, and his debts had all passed to his brother, a hard and bitter man named Josiah Cole, who wanted nothing to do with a mail-order bride who was, in his words, a stranger with no claim and no use. Hannah stood in that dusty street with the wind kicking grit against her ankles and felt the full weight of her situation settle upon her like a stone. She was 23 years old, orphaned since 16, and had crossed half a continent on the strength of a dead man's promise. She had no money for the return fare. She had no family waiting anywhere. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate, gnawing fear of what became of women alone on the frontier, women who fell into the saloons or worse, women who simply vanished into the hard country and were never spoken of again. She had heard those stories on the long ride west, whispered by other passengers, and she had promised herself she would not become one of them. It was in this moment of raw desperation that she first laid eyes on Silas Bodine. He was sitting alone at the far end of the boardwalk outside the Mercantile, a tall man with sun-darkened skin and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, dressed in a black coat gone pale with dust, a Colt revolver strapped low on his hip. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth as they passed, and Hannah noticed how conversations quieted when he was near, how mothers pulled their children a little closer. She would learn within the hour, from the frightened whispers of the boarding house keeper, that this was Silas Bodine, a man some called the most feared gunman in the territory, a man rumored to have killed 7 men, a man who had ridden with outlaws in his younger years before something had changed him, though nobody could say exactly what. He kept to himself on a modest spread outside of town, spoke to almost no one, and was regarded with the kind of fear that keeps a man safe from casual company but leaves him entirely alone. But fear was a luxury Hannah could no longer afford, because that same evening, the boarding house keeper's husband, a coarse man who ran the local saloon, had come to her room with an offer dressed up as charity. He explained, not unkindly but not gently either, that a woman without means in Redemption Gulch had few honest paths forward, and that he could offer her a position pouring drinks and keeping company with the miners who came down from the hills with gold dust in their pockets. Hannah understood exactly what kind of company he meant, and she refused him with as much dignity as she could summon, though her hands shook long after he left. She lay awake that night listening to the wind rattle the shutters, praying with a fervor she had not felt since her mother's funeral, asking God for some door, any door, that did not lead to ruin. The answer came to her the following morning in the unlikeliest of forms. She had gone walking at dawn to clear her head, out past the edge of town where the desert stretched gold and endless toward distant mountains, and there she found Silas Bodine watering his horse at the public trough, alone as always. Something in her, some final reserve of courage born entirely of desperation, propelled her forward before fear could stop her. She had heard, in her few hours in town, that the feared gunman was in fact unmarried, that he owned land outright, and that whatever violence lived in his past, he had never once raised a hand against a woman or a soul who hadn't drawn on him first. It was a thin thread of reasoning spun from rumor and terror in equal measure, but it was the only thread she had. She walked up to him with her heart hammering so hard she feared he could hear it, and before he had even fully turned to face her, the words tumbled out of her in a rush, raw and unguarded and utterly without pretense. She told him her name, told him of Thaddeus Cole's death, told him of Josiah's rejection and the saloon keeper's offer, and then, with tears finally breaking free down her dust-streaked cheeks, she said the words that would become the whole hinge of her life. "Please marry me. It's the only way they'll let me live." She did not know, in that moment, that a stray dog had startled his horse, that the animal had reared, and that the sudden crack of a wagon, while snapping under a heavy load nearby, had sounded so like a gunshot that half the street had flinched. It was this same commotion, this same startling crack, that had drawn a small crowd to witness Hannah on her knees in the dust, gripping the sleeve of the most feared man in the territory, begging for her life in the only way she knew how. Silas Bodine looked down at her for a long, silent moment, and those who watched would later say his face, usually carved from stone, seemed to crack open with something like recognition, something like old pain surfacing. He had not expected kindness to find him again, not after everything he had done and everything he had lost. He had ridden with a gang of outlaws in his 20s, back in the bleeding years after the war, when a man with nothing could be talked into anything by other men with nothing. He had done things in those years that visited him still in the dark hours before dawn, and he had killed the last of his old gang himself, 3 years past, when they had tried to drag him back into robbing a payroll wagon, and he had refused, and blood had been spilled because of his refusal. He had buried his own brother-in-arms that day, a man he had once called friend, and he had ridden into Redemption Gulch afterward and never left, living alone on his land, believing himself unfit for gentler company, believing the fear other men held for him was simply the truth of what he was. And yet here was this stranger, this trembling woman with flower-pale knuckles gripping his sleeve, looking at him not with the terror everyone else wore, but with the desperate hope of someone who had decided, against all evidence, that he might be safe. He helped her to her feet, his hands surprisingly gentle for hands that had done such violence, and he said, in a voice roughened by years of disuse, that he would not let any harm come to her, married or not, but that if marriage was what would keep the wolves from her door, then he supposed he could see his way to it, provided she understood plainly what she was binding herself to. He told her, right there on that dusty street with half the town pretending not to listen, that he was a man with blood on his hands and a reputation he had earned honestly, and that she deserved to know the truth of him before she tied her life to his. Hannah, wiping her eyes, told him that she had seen enough of the world's cruelty to know that a reputation and a man's true heart were not always the same thing, and that she would rather take her chances with an honest sinner than a smiling wolf in the saloon. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who came through Redemption Gulch once a month, in a ceremony so plain and unadorned it might have been mistaken for a business transaction by anyone who did not look closely at the two people standing before the altar, one with the wary hope of a man who had long since stopped expecting good things, the other with the quiet determination of a woman who had run out of any other road to walk. The town watched with open curiosity and no small amount of gossip, certain the marriage was a sham, certain it would not last the winter, certain that a woman as gentle as Hannah could not long endure a man as hard as Silas Bodine was rumored to be. But the winter came and went, and something began to shift in that small house on the edge of the desert. Hannah discovered, in the slow accumulation of ordinary days, that the man the town feared was not the man who lived beneath her roof. Silas rose before dawn to tend his cattle and mend his fences, worked until his hands bled without complaint, and in the evenings, when the sun bled orange across the desert horizon, he would sit on the porch and listen, truly listen, as Hannah spoke of her childhood in Missouri, of the mother she had lost to fever, and the father who had followed her into the grave a year later of what the doctors called a broken heart. He did not offer easy comfort or empty platitudes. He simply listened, the way a man listens who has learned that most people never really do, and slowly, in the listening, something between them began to grow that neither of them had dared to name. She learned the truth of his past, not from the town's whispers but from his own mouth, offered to her one night by the fire when he could no longer bear the weight of carrying it alone. He told her of the gang, of the robberies, of the night he had killed his own former friend to protect a payroll clerk who had done nothing to deserve dying. He told her he had turned himself in afterward, expecting to hang, and that the circuit judge, weighing the circumstances and the testimony of the clerk he had saved, had shown him a mercy he had never believed he deserved, sentencing him instead to 5 years which he had served honestly before returning to build a quiet life on land his father had left him. He told her that every soul in Redemption Gulch knew this history and had decided, in the way small towns often do, that a man's worst day defined the whole of him forever. Hannah, hearing this confession, took his scarred hand in both of hers and told him that she had read in Scripture that there was more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 who never strayed, and that she believed, with everything in her, that the man before her was living proof of exactly that kind of grace. It was not long after this that trouble arrived at their door in the shape of Josiah Cole, the very brother-in-law who had turned Hannah away upon her arrival. Josiah had fallen into debt gambling in the very saloon that had once tried to claim Hannah for its own, and in his desperation, he had begun spreading a vicious rumor through town that Silas Bodine had married Hannah only to get his hands on land that had once belonged to Thaddeus Cole, land that bordered Silas's own modest spread and would, combined, make him one of the largest landholders in the county. It was a lie built from nothing but Josiah's own greed and shame. But lies have a way of finding fertile ground in a town already primed to believe the worst of a man like Silas. And within a fortnight, the whispers had grown into something uglier, a gathering of angry men outside the sheriff's office demanding that the matter be settled, that the truth be dragged into the light one way or another. The sheriff, a weathered but fair man named Elias Grant, who had watched Silas keep his nose clean for 3 years running, called for a public reckoning rather than let the mob's anger boil over into violence. He summoned both Silas and Josiah to the town square on a Sunday afternoon, with half of Redemption Gulch turned out to watch, and it was there, under the wide Arizona sky, that the truth finally came clawing its way free. Hannah, standing beside her husband with her chin lifted despite her trembling hands, spoke first, telling the gathered crowd of her own desperate arrival in town, of Josiah's cold rejection of her, of the saloon keeper's indecent offer, and of how it was Silas alone who had shown her mercy when every other door had been slammed shut. She told them that Silas had never once spoken of Thaddeus Cole's land, had never asked after it, had in fact refused an offer from a cattle baron the very month prior to buy out his acreage at a handsome price because he said a man's home wasn't for sale at any figure. It was Sheriff Grant himself who then revealed what his own quiet investigation had uncovered, that Josiah Cole had forged a debt against his dead brother's estate and had been slowly selling off Thaddeus's cattle to cover his own gambling losses at the very saloon whose owner had tried to claim Hannah, and that the rumor about Silas had been spread deliberately to distract the town from Josiah's own theft. The crowd's anger, so recently aimed at Silas, turned like a wind changing direction, and Josiah, cornered and exposed, broke down in the dust much as Hannah once had, though for far less noble reasons, confessing to his crimes before the sheriff led him away in irons. In the hush that followed, with the whole town watching, an old widow named Constance Abernathy, who had lost her own husband to outlaws years before and had been among the loudest voices fearing Silas Bodine, stepped forward from the crowd. She walked to where Silas stood with Hannah's hand in his, and she said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, that she had spent 3 years judging a man for a past he had already paid for in full, while never once asking herself what kind of man he had become since, and that she was sorry for the fear she had carried in her heart, mistaking it for wisdom when it had only ever been unexamined prejudice. Others in the crowd, moved by her honesty, began to murmur their own quiet apologies, and something shifted that day in Redemption Gulch, a slow thaw in a town that had let fear stand in for truth for far too long. From that Sunday forward, life did not become easy, for the frontier rarely gave easy gifts, but it became something sweeter than easy. It became honest. Silas found himself invited, awkwardly at first, and then with growing warmth, to town gatherings he had long avoided. Hannah began teaching letters to the ranch children on Sunday afternoons, having discovered a gift for patience that the little ones responded to with open affection. 2 years into their marriage, a daughter was born to them, whom they named Grace, for Hannah insisted that grace was the truest word she knew to describe the strange and winding path that had brought her to that small house on the desert's edge, kneeling before a stranger and finding, against every fear the world had taught her to carry, not a monster, but a man capable of the deepest tenderness. If this story has touched your heart, even a little, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight, and share with me one lesson this story stirred in your own heart, whether it was about mercy, about second chances, or about looking past a person's reputation to see the truth of who they really are. Years later, when travelers passed through Redemption Gulch and asked about the tall rancher with the quiet eyes and the scar along his jaw, the townsfolk no longer spoke of him as the most feared man in the territory. They spoke instead of Silas Bodine, a man who had once been lost and had found his way home through the courage of a desperate woman's plea, and of Hannah Bodine, who had walked into a strange town with nothing but a carpet bag and a prayer, and had built, out of fear and mercy and stubborn faith, a life worth every hardship it had cost her to find it. Their story became, in time, the kind that mothers told their daughters on cold winter nights. A reminder that the Lord's grace often arrives wearing the last face you would expect, and that the most feared men sometimes carry the gentlest hearts, waiting only for someone brave enough or desperate enough to ask. If this story moved you tonight, if you believe, as Hannah and Silas came to believe, in redemption and second chances and the quiet miracles of an honest heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need this story today, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale of faith, courage, and love from the American frontier. Thank you for riding along with me today, friends, and until next time, may you always find the grace you're searching for.